We're in the middle of Pei Dalet of an Aleph. We are towards the bottom of the page. We are speaking about there are two types of wheat. There's the red wheat and the white wheat. From the fact that our Mishnah mentioned one of the wheats is called a shecham masis, from the word chama, from the word sun, Rav Papa concluded that the sun is red. He said, look in the morning, look in the evening, you'll see red rays of sunlight. So you see the sun is red. Then we said maybe not, because by tzara'as, we compare the sun to the shade, just like tzara'as is to the skin, and tzara'as is white. We said, no, it was just a loose comparison, that's all. So we are now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the bottom, third to last word. Ulamad solik daitin mi kara. We had that one point where we thought maybe the sun's not really red. If that would be true, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that Hakasam could safro banyo? In the morning and the evening, the sun is red. So, like, what was that thought of the Gemara to bring in Tzara'as, to try to prove to us from verses that the sun is white? But look in the morning and look in the evening, you'll see it's red. Says the Gemara, we thought like this. In the morning, the sun passes, the sun rises in the east, that's in the west. So in the east, it passes by the beginning of Gan Eden, where there are these certain roses, and the light from the roses glares onto the sun, and those are red. The roses are red, right? Violets are blue or something, yeah. So the sun is red because of the rays of the roses of Gan Eden. And Bipanya, when the sun is setting in the west, so that's going to go dechalfa da piska de Gehenim. It's going to pass by the opening of Gehenim, and that's also red, fire. So therefore, it's going to the rays are going to the sun is reflecting the rays of Gan Eden. And there are some that say the opposite, that meaning when the sun is in the east, so the western lights of Gehenim are reflecting on it, and that's why it's red. Or when the sun is in the west, the eastern lights of the red roses reflect the sun. Reflect the sun. Arcade on Sunday, yeah. So just a card. Reflect the sun. They reflect the sun. So either way, that's what we thought at one point, that maybe that's why the sun is red. I saw that there are numerous commentators that try to reconcile this idea of the sun being red with modern day science. So we know it's red already, so beyond the scope of this work for now. But if you're interested in more, you let me know.
Because science is a prohibited subject, I'll be here.
Science
math is allowed, but not science.
Science is only prohibited because I'm not so versed in it, but
no, that was one of the rules from Rabbi Fisher.
No science.
No science. Math, yes, but no science.
That's funny. Okay, talking about that. No, so okay, let's see. Yayin v'nimtza chometz. Next case of the Mishnah. Unfortunately, you went to buy your wine for Pesach. You came home and you were upset that it turned out to be vinegar. And then you tried to have 4 cups of vinegar. It's not going to go. So if you do that, if you get wine and then vinegar, shnehen yicholin lachzer b'hen. Both the seller and the buyer, they can both retract on this sale, because the seller thought he was selling, vinegar. The buyer thought he was buying wine. It was a mekachtos. It was a sale that was invalid. So both of them are able to retract.
Do not mix wine and vinegar.
Do not mix wine and vinegar, correct. Lema masnisin Rebbehi. Okay, so maybe our Mishnah is going like the opinion of Rebbe, the low Rabbanon, and not the Rabbanon. The Tanya, turning the page. Yayin v'chometz min echad. Wine and vinegar is one species. Now, it doesn't mean it's one species, because we said no science, right? Now, wine and vinegar are 2 species, but there are certain circumstances that it's going to be in the same category in Jewish law, in halacha. For instance, when you're taking off truma, you have to take off truma from your field. You have to give, between 1/40th and 1/60th to the kohanim. So now, if you have, let's say, a field of one species of produce, can you take off from another species, and that would exempt yourself from this species? So let's say, you have a lot of cucumbers growing, a lot of peppers growing. So you can't take off truma from the pepper and say, here, I'm giving this to the kohen, and now my cucumbers are exempt from truma. Each species needs its own separation of truma. However, by yayin v'chometz, by wine and vinegar, there you could take off from one, and it'll work for the other. Another example is there's a halacha called modeh b'miktsas. If someone says you owe me $100 and you say no, I only owe you $50, so you take a special shvuah, a special oath in the Torah called an oath of modeh b'miktsas. However, that oath is only in the event that you admit to something that's like the claim that the guy is claiming. So if he says you owe me 100 apples, you say it's not true. I owe you 50 baseball cards. Okay, so that's not modeh b'miktsas. Those are two totally separate things. But if the guy says that you owe me this amount of wine, and he responds with a partial amount of chometz, the vinegar, or vice versa, so then in halacha that would be considered one. And why that's true is a good question. Meaning why we chose all of a sudden wine and vinegar. Maybe they're similar.
Wine turns to vinegar.
Why that? Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Wine turns into vinegar.
Similar. Yeah.
It is similar. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. So it's not the same as I guess apples and baseball cards, right? So yeah, yain v'chometz min echad.
Except if you're Steve Jobs.
Yeah, if you're Steve Jobs, yeah.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah. Yain v'chometz min. Baseball cards. They have those in South Africa. Baseball cards.
What's baseball?
There's baseball, rugby cards, cricket. Yain v'chometz min echad hu. Okay, but Rebbe Omer, shnei minin. Rebbe says that they're really two separate species. They're two separate products, even in all areas of halakha. So now our Mishnah says you bought wine, ended up being vinegar. You bought vinegar, ended up being wine. Both the buyer and the seller could retract the sale. Sounds like our Mishnah is going like Rebbe that says they're really two separate species, right? Because if they're really one species, you can make an argument that maybe in the case of sales, they shouldn't be able to retract the sale. Says the Gemara, no. Afilu tema Rabbanan. The Rabbanan agree that in the area of sales, if you think you're selling wine and you receive vinegar, you could retract the sale. They only argue in other areas, such as truma. When it comes to giving your tithes and your truma, that's where they argue on Rebbe, and only there. Who could Rabbi Ilah, and this goes with the opinion of Rabbi Ilah, who says the following: truma. How do I know if I take a worse crop of mine, something which is less valuable, or maybe and I take off truma, that would affect my good crop. Truma. How do I know that taking off a worse crop of something instead of taking off the best crop was going to be good truma? So let's say you have 1,000 cucumbers and you have the really high quality ones, and you have the really low quality ones, the ones that are going to go to waste very soon. So maybe you would think that as long as I take off any cucumbers, that's fine. So apparently there's a special, we want you to take off the best part of your truma, not the worst. However, if you take off the worst though, according to Rabbi Ilah, it's still going to be good. How do I know? Shinamar, it says in the parsha of Meiser, I think this is by the Levites, the Levi has to take off. He has to take off and give from his Meiser truma to the Kohen. It says you should make sure you shouldn't carry sin. When you take off the best, the choicest amount of your truma, mimenu. So now, what does it mean? If you shouldn't bear sin when you take off the choicest. Well, if you could only take off the choicest, the best part of your crop. So even if you've taken off a worse part of your crop, you haven't committed any avera. The food is called tevel. It's called tevel. That's its status. You're not allowed to eat tevel. You have to take off truma to make it not tevel anymore. So if the halacha would have been that you have to take off the choicest, the best part of your truma, so then if you didn't do that, you just didn't fulfill the mitzvah. But you're not bearing an avera. So im eino kadosh. If it's not kadosh, nesiyas chet lama. If when you took off your worst cucumbers, if you did nothing because it's the worst crop, not the best crop, so then you just didn't do anything. You got a 0. You're supposed to take off your best cucumbers, and you didn't. So now go take off your best cucumbers. There's no avera with that. It must be that even when you take off your worst crop, it's still considered truma, and that's when the Torah says make sure you take off the best crop. Because if you take off a worse crop, even though it'll work officially, but then you would be sort of bearing sin. You'd be carrying chait. So says the Gemara, Mikan l'Torah min hara al yafa, shet truma so truma, and that's gonna be the same thing if you take vinegar you remove vinegar, instead of taking off, you have a bunch of wine and vinegar, and you take off truma from it now. I think now is wine season. People just went to make wine yesterday. So when they're taking off truma, if they, instead of taking off, their best grapes, they took off vinegar, so then that's going to be, it'll still make the food not tevel. However, that's going to not be what the Torah wants. Aval inyan mekach u'memkar, when you're talking about sales, Reuben selling Shimon wine and Shimon received vinegar. Reuben sold him vinegar and he received wine. Even the Rabbanan, the Kuli Alma Ika, there it's so subjective. People don't want vinegar if they bought wine, and if they're cooking and they need their vinegar and they don't want wine. So when it comes to sales and dealing with people, it all depends really on what the person was thinking. What was he expecting to get? So that's when you deal with sales, it's going to be different than dealing with truma. So that's why our Mishnah that views wine and vinegar as two separate items. So that it really has nothing to do with the machlokas over there by truma. It has to do with just how people are. So since people view wine and vinegar differently, and people when they want wine they don't want vinegar. If you were to sell wine and come out with vinegar, then you could retract on that sale. It's called a mekachtos. It's an invalid sale, and that's what I'm just talking about. Okay. Next Mishnah, hamocher peirus lechavero. This is interesting. You're selling fruits to your friend. So what'd you do? The Gemara is going to elaborate on this. Don't worry. Mashach velo madad. So you right away you literally pulled, which means you acquired the fruits through the mechanism of mashicha, of pulling. Not that you always have to do a mashicha, but you. So you were madad, you were mashach velo madad. Let's say you just acquired it without measuring. Madad is to measure, without measuring exactly how much you purchased. That's still good. You still acquired. Just because you didn't measure, but the measuring itself. Remember, we had yesterday that people bought something and then went to go check it in the marketplace. When you're buying something, you don't have always your scales and measurements with you, right? So, but we say that's still a legal sale because measuring something is not. Maybe it's a good idea. It'll show you how much it's worth, but it's not preventative. It's not ma'akev. It doesn't prevent the sale from going through. So that's the first case. Mashach v'lo madad kana. Flip case. Madad v'lo mashach lo kana. So if this is interesting. This is meaning what's a novelty. We'll see. But if you measured it, but you didn't actually pull it, didn't acquire it, then of course you have not been kona. So the Gemara is going to tell us the case at the end of Pei Amud Aleph, and because obviously if you didn't do an acquisition, obviously you haven't acquired it. If I measure, I go to the store and I measure, I put all my potatoes I got on the scale and I measured it, so the guy can't come to me at Safeway and say, oh, you bought it now. I didn't buy it. I just measured it. So the Gemara is talking about exactly. There's one case where this is a novelty. But okay, so mother v'lo mashach lo kana. Fine. Im haya pikeach. We had this language a while ago. If you're a smart guy, socher es mekoman. You're going to rent its space. So once again, the Rashbam says we're going to talk about the case that this is relevant. Halokeach pishlan mechavero. You bought flax from your friend. Harei lo kana achi italtalenu mimakom lemakom. Until you've taken the flax and you've transported it from place X to place Y, you haven't acquired it. Now the Rashbam just says it's the usual way to transport flax is for moving it and not from lifting it up. That's why we chose you have to move it from one place to another. Not to say if you pick it up you haven't acquired it. It's just that's the normal way people go and they take things. They take flax from place A to place B. Okay. Now let's say you had something which was attached to the ground. The Gemara again is going to elaborate on this. So then the talash, if you picked it from the ground, so the seller is selling you a product that's attached to the ground. Now, as long as you talash, if you just pulled it up, you pulled it out of the ground, kol shehu, even a little bit, then you've acquired it. This is all going to be clear, hopefully, in the next day or two.
So you just get all the U-picks.
Okay.
U-pick.
Oh.
Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan. Rav Asi said in the name of Rav Yochanan, let's say the following case. Madad, you measured out whatever you acquired, you measured out your produce. V'hiniach al gabe simta. So simta we had. Simta is this area that's not a public thoroughfare, but you want to discuss a private matter. Where are you going to go? So you go to the simta. It was right next to the public thoroughfare. In my mind, it's kind of like imagine you have like the emergency lanes on the highway. The cars don't go there, but if they need to stop, they have an area to stop. So it's something like that. It's it's an area that's it's not as commonly used as a public thoroughfare. That would be Rosh Hashanah. However, it can overflow, or it can have, it's like an extension a little bit of the Rosh Hashanah. But the point is that it's an area that's not owned by me. It's not owned by you. So in that area, if you want to acquire something, says Rabbi Yochanan, if you measured it and then you placed it down in the simta, then you've acquired it. So, which is a novelty, because placing something down in a public area, who says you've acquired it? It sounds like right now, if you made a deal and we established that we're going to buy something, and then I place it down, so the Rashbam says, putting it down in the simta is ki'ilu hinicha mocher b'rshus shalokech. It's as if I put it in the domain of the buyer. So to figure out why that's true, because it's not the buyer's domain, but that's what Rabbi Yochanan says right now. If you made a measurement and two people are speaking about a deal, and the seller puts down the potatoes next to the buyer in the simta, he has acquired it. Amr le Reb Zera le Reb Asi, Shemaloi Shamar Rebbe, Ella b'mode letoch kupaso. Maybe Reb Asi said this statement from Rabbi Yochanan. Reb Zera, very respectfully, asks Reb Asi, maybe Rebbe didn't hear Rabbi Yochanan, meaning he only heard Rabbi Yochanan in the event that the seller actually puts the produce, the potatoes, in the buyer's vessel. He puts it in the buyer's basket. Maybe that's what you heard, because just to put it down on the floor of a simta, that you haven't placed it in the domain of the buyer. So maybe that's where you heard the case. So Amarle, Dami Hai Merabanon. So he said back, I think he's speaking back now, that you're similar to one of these Rabbanon that never learned anything. Lo Gamri Inshi Shmaita. It says Madal Letoku Pasa, Name Rabbi. Come on. You're compared to someone who never learned the thing in their life. Putting something down in someone else's vessel, of course you've acquired it. You don't need Rabbi Yochanan for that. That's obvious. So obviously Rabbi Yochanan was teaching me a novelty, that even when I put it down in the simta, that's still as if I put it down in the buyer's domain, because putting it down in the buyer's basket is obvious. So we don't need Rabbi Yochanan for that. So, okay, so the Gemara asks, well, kibla minei, olo kibla minei. At the end of the day, did Reb Zera accept this from Rav Asi or not? He asked him a question. He got a little bit, a harsh response. He's compared to someone who doesn't know anything. Okay, but did he accept or did he not accept? Meaning, at the end of the day, is there a machlokus right now in what Rabbi Yochanan said, Rav Asi versus Reb Zera? Or do they all agree to the novelty of Rabbi Yochanan? Okay, let's see. Tashma, we learned in the Brisa, Amar Rabbi Yanai, Amar Rebbe. Rabbi Yanai said, in the name of Rebbe, what if you have a chatzer, a courtyard, hashutfin? So two people own a courtyard together, they're partners. Konin zemizeh. Vague line, they can acquire one from the other. So we both own a courtyard. Now imagine in that courtyard, you put something down to sell to me. So it's the same thing as a simta. A joint courtyard is not owned by me or owned by you. It's owned by both of us. So if I want to sell you something and I put it down in a joint courtyard, that's also not putting it down in my domain, right? It's putting down in our domain. So that's the same as putting it down in a simta. So now, says the Gemara, Mai lav al gabe karka. Is it not talking about where you just put down on the ground of the joint courtyard, and yet you've still acquired it? And if that brisa would be saying that, so then Rabbi Yochanan would make sense that even when you put it down in the simta, you've also acquired it. Says the Gemara, lo, betoch kupasa. You could read the brisa as you put it into the guy's basket, and that's why you've acquired it. And therefore, we don't have a resolution for our question about did Reb Zera accept this opinion of Rav Asi in the name of Rav Yochanan or not. Okay. Hachi inami mistaber. It's very logical that only putting something in the basket is going to be. It will then and only then will the guy acquire it if you, the buyer, and the seller are both in a joint area, such as a simta or a chatzer. That's a courtyard that's joint. Why is this very logical? The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now we have Rav Yaakov in the name of Rav Yochanan. Madad v'hiniach al gabe simta. The buyer and the seller, they measured something and they placed it in the simta. Lo kana, you have not acquired it. So hold on, we just had the first statement of today from Rabbi Yochanan. You put in a simta, you have acquired it. That was Rav Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now we have Rav Yaakov in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that says you have not acquired it. So that's a contradiction in Rabbi Yochanan. Elolav shmamina, logically, we can have the following resolution. Kan b'moded letoch kupa. So kan b'moded al gabe karka shmamina. The way you're going to resolve the contradiction of these two statements of Rabbi Yochanan is the one where you've acquired it, the latter statement, because you put it in a joined area and you put it in the buyer's basket. But if you're in a simta or if you're in a courtyard that's owned jointly it's owned by both of you, putting it on the ground is not going to be a good sale. So therefore, since we have a contradiction in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the way we're going to resolve it is you have to put it into the buyer's domain, which would mean putting it into his basket. Putting it onto the ground next to the buyer in a domain which is not the buyer's is not going to suffice. Now, it's interesting, often when you have two opinions in the name of somebody that contradict each other, sometimes the Gemara will say, yeah, it's two opinions according to Rabbi Yochanan. But here the Gemara says it's much more logical to resolve the contradiction when you have a good resolution. So if that would be true, that would make sense that according to Rabbi Zera now, he did not accept Rav Asi's novelty. Once you have this other statement of Rabbi Yochanan, a very logical way to resolve it. Okay, Tashma. A brisa says, Madad v'lo mashach lo kana. If the buyer and the seller, they're making a deal and one measures how much food he's about to buy, and what happens, he measures, but he didn't acquire, he didn't do a mashika, he didn't pull it, so lo kana, he has not acquired. Okay, so ma'ilav besimta, are we not talking about where you put it in a simta, where you guys are in a simta discussing this sale, and if you were in a simta discussing this sale, so then the Gemara, 1 second. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, very good. The Rashbam says, what's the case over here? Madad v'lo mashach lo kana. You've only measured and you have not acquired. You haven't pulled it. So what are we talking about? Where did you put the produce? On the ground or in the vessel? To where? So the Gemara doesn't say. But the Rashbam makes a very you said that math is okay, right? So he makes a very mathematical calculation. The brisa says you have not acquired it. Now, where have you put the produce? If you placed it inside the buyer's receptacle, the buyer's basket, then everyone agrees that he's acquired it. So we're not going to come and argue now on everyone we just had earlier. Rather, it must be you put it on the ground. You put it on the ground next to the buyer, and that we say he hasn't acquired it. And if that would be true, that would be a proof to our earlier question of putting something on the ground of a simta. Have you acquired it or not? Says the Gemara, lo b'rshus harabim. We're talking about a b'rshus harabim, and therefore you can't bring me a proof of what would happen if you put it on the ground of a simta, because a simta is much less of a public thoroughfare than a b'rshus harabim is. So therefore, you don't have a proof. So this was really our Mishnah said this. So ihachi ema reisha, if you're talking about a b'rshus harabim, so this is the second part of our Mishnah. So then what's the first part of our Mishnah talking about? Ihachi ema reisha mashach v'lo madad. The beginning of our Mishnah says if you've pulled it and you haven't measured it, you have acquired it. So now we like to make our Mishnah universal, meaning it's talking about one case. So if the second part of the Mishnah is talking about a case where you have not pulled it, you've only measured it, and we're talking about that you placed it on the ground of a public thoroughfare, so that means that the ratio of the Mishnah is talking about where you have pulled it, but what are we talking about? A public thoroughfare. A public thoroughfare, says the Gemara, that can't be. Meshicha b'Rosh Hashanah mikanya. You can't acquire things by pulling it in Rosh Hashanah, right? Because once again, Meshicha is like you're pulling into your own domain. But if you're standing in Midtown Manhattan, so you could pull things from today until tomorrow, right? But you haven't acquired it because it's not that's a public domain, not a private domain. So Meshicha b'Rosh Hashanah mikanya v'habai Rav Mitravayu, Abai and Rava both said Mesira Kona b'Rosh Hashanah, grabbing the item, only then grasping it, that will acquire in Rosh Hashanah. And in a chater she'einish shneim, and let's say a chater that belongs to nobody, so then you can acquire with mesira. But meshicha is only kona b'simta, in a simta, or a chater shehi shel shneim, or a chater that it belongs to both of you. The hagba kona b'chol makom. So it does not make sense that our Mishnah is going to go against this ruling that a meshicha actually works in a Rosh Hashanah. We're not going to say that. So therefore, even the latter case does not refer to Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, it would refer to a simta, and therefore that would answer our resolution. It sounds like the Brisa, the Mishnah, is a proof that if you put something on the ground of a simta, so then you have acquired it. Because if it's talking about a public thoroughfare, it would make trouble with the beginning of the Mishnah. So therefore we're stuck. Says they weren't. No, you're not stuck. My mashach nami de katani. What it means is when it says mashach in the ratio, what it means in the beginning of the Mishnah, my mashach nami de katani mershus rabim lesimta. It means you pulled it. We are talking about a Rosh Hashanah. You can't pull things in Rosh Hashanah. You're right. You're pulling it from a Rosh Hashanah into a simta. If you pull it from a Rosh Hashanah into a simta, then you could acquire in such a way. Because once again, a meshicha, a pulling, is a form of acquisition, which is going to be valid in a simta and not valid in a Rosh Hashanah. So if you say like this, the Mishnah is universal. The location of the Mishnah will be a public domain, or Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, when it says madad v'lo mashach, you've measured and not pulled, it's talking about you put it on the floor of a simta, on a floor of Rosh Hashanah, I'm sorry. And the beginning of the Mishnah that talked about doing a meshicha that's gonna work is just referring to the Rosh Hashanah as your starting point, not as your end point. The end point is a simta, and therefore you have acquired it. If that's true, okay, this is too good. Ema seifa. The Seif of the Mishnah says, if you're a pikeach, if you're a smart guy, and you want to acquire from the seller, just socher es mekoman, just rent that space. So we had this concept a little bit earlier, right? You want to buy something, and the simple case is that you're right now in the seller's home. So how are you going to buy the object? So one way to buy the object is you could rent out the space where the object you want to buy is. So you want to buy his fast working coffee machine, so you have to rent from the Kollel, that front area, and therefore you've acquired the coffee machine. What?
Not fast working.
Yeah, Steve wanted a fast. That would be a method toast. That doesn't work. Steve wanted a fast working coffee machine. That's like wine and vinegar. That's it's two separate kind of coffee machines. Yeah, but if that would be true, that the Seifa of our Mishnah says, the latter part of our Mishnah is talking about renting an area from a seller. So the Bershus Harabim, if the Mishnah's location is a public domain, so Bershus Harabim Mimanagar, who are you renting from? Bershus Harabim? You're renting from the whole city? You can't rent a place in Bershus Harabim. Says the Gemara, okay, so we can still make it work. Hachi Kamar, the Im Bershus Bailim, you have to add into the Mishnah. If you happen to be in the domain of the original owner, then Im Haya Pikeach Socher Es Mekoman, then you're going to acquire from the seller. So if it just fix up the Mishnah that we're talking about, where you're standing in the area of the Bailam, in the owner's domain, and therefore you can rent the space and acquire the object. So it's really like its own statement. So now, the cases in our Mishnah are either talking about where you place something down in a simta, or you placed it in a Rosh Hashanah and then you pulled it into a simta. One of two options, depending on if you agree to this idea that you can acquire something by placing it in a simta or not. Okay. Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Travayu, Caleb shel Kona, Caleb shel Adam, vessels of a person, Kona lo b'chol makom. So you have the vessels of a person, and you can acquire things like we just saw from placing items into that vessel. Now, what's b'chol makom? B'chol makom means even if you're in the seller's domain. So usually the whole idea of an acquisition, you have us by a wedding also, all the different forms of a chuppah. You stand under the canopy, then there's a yichud room, before there's a bedekin. Those are all different forms of acquisitions. Acquisition in general is you're trying to, symbolically show or physically show that you're bringing the item into the person's domain. So now if you're usually in the house of a seller, so it's very hard to show that you're bringing to your domain because you're still in the house of the seller. So, but if you have a basket, that basket is yours. When you place something into that basket, that's considered like putting it into your domain. So that's going to be a valid acquisition. The only place it's not going to work is chutz mi rishus harabim. If you have your vessels in a rishus harabim, so then that's not going to work. And the Rashbam says, so to a chatzer that doesn't belong to anybody. So both those cases, the fact that your vessels are in a Rosh Hashanah, that's not going to, you can't acquire like that. Just thinking now, like what the logic is, what the difference is. At the end of the day, it's your basket, right? But I guess a basket really is like it's its own domain. So when you're in a public thoroughfare, everything in the public thoroughfare is the public domain. So you don't have a private area in a public thoroughfare. I guess, but if you're not in a public thoroughfare, so then it's more understandable how your basket has its own individual domain. Okay, I don't know if to think about that. Why should a basket be any different?
Right.
Um,
Public versus private.
yeah. Okay, yeah, we have to. Yeah, that's interesting.
Here they say he doesn't have a right to put it in the
Why?
public domain.
Yeah, why not?
Well, it's kind of it's reversed, which is the basket works wherever you have a right to put it.
Uh-huh.
If he brings it to the seller's domain, the seller says, "Okay, you can keep it there." Then you got it there.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Meaning in the seller's house, I'm allowed to bring in my vessels.
Well, the seller lets you.
He lets me. In a public domain, there's no one to let me.
That's the
Okay. Food for thought. Yeah. The Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they argue. Okay, so I guess it's not universal. Machlokas, Rav and Shmuel against Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Can you, with your basket, which is placed in a public domain, and now the seller goes and wants to, sell you something, and can you place that into the basket, and then you've acquired those that produce. Machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Amr of Papa, no, lo pligi. Rav and Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they aren't arguing. Kan b'rshus harabim, kan b'simta. It just depends what you're talking about. Everyone agrees by a simta you have acquired it, and everyone agrees by rshus harabim you have not acquired it. The problem is that they said that you have acquired it in a rshus harabim. So the amai karula rshus harabim. If this is true, so then Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that said you could acquire, if they really mean a simta, why did they refer to it as a rshus harabim? Says the Gemara, she'ein rshus yachid. It was just referring to it because it's not a rshus yachid. So it's referring to it as a simta, but instead of referring to it as a simta, it's calling it a public domain, meaning in comparison to a private domain, a simta is a very public domain. So Rav Papa didn't want to make this big argument about acquiring objects in a public domain in the buyer's vessel. So he said that which when they said Rishus Rabim, they were just talking as opposed to Rishus Yachid. This is very public, but they're referring to a simta. Says the Gemara, it is logical that sometimes when you're talking about a simta, you might refer to it as a Rishus Rabim just to contrast it to a Rishus Yachid. Let's see where that exists. The Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this is our third statement today in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kelev shel Adam konelo b'chol makom, sheyesh lo rishos lahanicho. Your vessels can acquire for you b'chol makom sheyesh lo rishos lahanicho. In every place that you're allowed to place your kelim, you are allowed to, they can acquire for you. So yesh lo rishos in, ein lo rishos lo shmamina. So Rabbi Yochanan himself, we have Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, saying that your kelim, your vessels, can only acquire for you where you have the rishus, where you have the ability, the permission, the right to place them down. So we just said that Rabbi Yochanan says your vessel could acquire for you in a public domain. And then we said that Rav Papa says, no, it means a simta. It was called public domain because it's not a private domain. So then we're saying that's also very logical because once again, Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, such a concept that your vessels can only acquire where you have the permission, you have the rishus, you're allowed to place those objects down. Now, once again, this is our second time today that we had a contradicting statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Both times the Gemara said the same thing. Hachanayim mistabra. Right? It's very logical that instead of making it an argument, rather we're going to agree. Because once again, you don't want to make a contradiction in what Rabbi Yochanan said. You'd rather reconcile his words. So therefore, it's very logical that Rabbi Yochanan really was talking about a simta and not a Rishus Rabim. And this, like what Steve was saying, when you don't have permission to put down your vessels, you can't acquire. In a seller's house, there you have permission, and he lets you, right. If he lets you walk into his house and you're wearing a backpack, so unless he says backpack, no, right? Like something you have in Israel, you have in Israel, like you can't just bring in any bags somewhere, leave your bag outside or whatever. But in a regular case, so it's like that. I know people's phones and laptops. I know your mind's going off. Okay, we still have 5 minutes, I know. Okay, we'll try. The problem is the next thing is one very large list. So we'll try, and if in the next 2 minutes we don't finish, we'll start again from this area tomorrow. It's one long, a little bit complicated. Tashma, Brysa said, Arba midos b'mochrin. There are 4 kinds of sales that we're going to discuss. So they're a little bit specific. So the achlo nismale mida. So basically, someone gave you a measuring vessel. You're selling a lot of produce to a buyer. Someone gave you a vessel. So now, at what point does it belong to the seller? At what point does it belong to the buyer? He loaned you a measuring vessel. So now, achlo nismale mida, until it hasn't been filled up, you haven't finished measuring, the vessel belongs to the mocher. He's borrowing it. He has the right to borrow it. Mishin nismale, once you filled up, you finished measuring, you finished using the measuring cup, so now the lokeach is able to borrow it. I guess to just check. The seller can use it until it's filled up, and he's finished measuring. And now the buyer could use it, I guess he's allowed to borrow this now to measure his items. Yeah, the Rashbam says that until you filled up the measuring cup, right? In case wine spilled or oil spilled or the price went up, the seller can always go back on it. So as long as the seller is still measuring his produce, the measuring cup belongs to him. He's allowed to use it. Once he's finished measuring, now it's in the domain of the lokeach. So the Rashbam says, because this is the deal. You're allowed to borrow my measuring cup. The seller can borrow it to ensure that he's selling the exact amount. if anything spills, just so he knows exactly how much he's selling. Once he's finished measuring, the buyer can then use that. He can take the measuring cup full of the produce, and now bring it and store his things away. So, yeah, okay. We're going to end up saying that once the seller finished measuring his produce, so it's now considered the buyer's. Once the measuring cup is the buyer's, we just learned that a buyer can acquire things in his vessel, even in the seller's domain. So as soon as the seller finishes measuring, so it belongs to the buyer even right now in the domain of the seller. So that's the first kind of sale, and the next 2 or 3 will continue tomorrow.
Wow.
Yeah.